We are live, ma'am. You can start.
All right. So, on the behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Panjab University, Chandigarh, and Center of Phenomenology and Cognitive Science, I take this opportunity to welcome our resource person for the special lecture in the field of experimental philosophy. I also welcome our students, teachers, and participants from this platform of Elenchus, a study circle run by the Department of Philosophy, sponsored by Indian Council of Philosophical Research, Ministry of Human Resource, New Delhi. I consider it a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Professor Kevin Reuter, who is an SNSF Excellencia Professor at the Institute of Philosophy, University of Zurich. I wish to inform the participants that SNSF professorship is primarily concerned with the domain of linguistics and cognitive sciences. The main aim in this area remains to examine the structure and meaning of philosophically relevant terms, both analytically and experimentally. Professor Kevin did his study in physics from Technical University of Munich, then MPhil and PhD from Birkbeck College, University of London, postdoctoral research from Reuter University, Bochum. He taught from 2015 to 2019 at the University of Bern, Switzerland. His areas of specializations are experimental philosophy, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, especially pain and emotions, rational decision theory, philosophy of language, and he's currently teaching courses on metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, and free will. He has published in reputed journals like Synthesis, Philosophy Compass, Review of Philosophy and Psychology, Language and Cognition, Cognitive Science in Psychology, Journal of Consciousness Studies. On the behalf of the Center of Phenomenology and Cognitive Science and my team members, Professor Seema Vinayak, Chairperson, Department of Psychology, and Piyush Parimoo, I welcome you and do hope that while you address the nature and problems of experimental philosophy, we will not only get an overview of this upcoming extension of philosophy as a discipline, but our dilemmas with regard to introducing experimentation in philosophy too shall be dissolved. We welcome you, Professor Kevin, once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you everybody for being here. Let me also just express my gratitude to the organizers for actually inviting me to give this talk today on the fundamentals of experimental philosophy. So before I start, let me just say that, of course, I welcome any questions and comments, both critical and more favorable, to the talk I will be giving. But also, if you wish to get in contact in regards to the contact at a later stage, please feel free to contact me. If you are interested, hopefully perhaps after this talk, in running your own experimental study in some philosophical domain, also get in contact with me or some fellow experimental philosophers. We're really there to help and to grow the experimental philosophical community. So let me just start my presentation. Can you see that? Excellent. Right, so I will be splitting my talk into two parts. In the first part, I would like to talk a little bit about the aims of experimental philosophy and talk a little bit about the background of this emerging field. In the second part, I would actually like to guide you through an example of an experiment that I've actually just conducted yesterday. I was hoping perhaps to do this live during the session, but I thought it might be a bit too tiresome in the end and take a little bit too long. So I'll do that a little bit in retrospect. But the idea is to give you to basically show you how experimental philosophers go about running these experiments, and what kind of consequences and conclusions we can draw from them. All right, so let's start with the first part. I guess when you hear about experimental philosophy, you might think that, well, these two ideas don't so well neatly sit together, philosophy and the experimental sciences, at least, I guess, stereotypically, perhaps illustrated here by these two images. We have this idea of philosophy being a discipline where we think deeply about certain paradoxes, challenges, and problems of the human condition in the world. And then on the other hand, we have the experimental sciences. Many experiments are being run in laboratories. You need expensive equipment, and you are handling big data, which you need to analyze. But I don't think this kind of dichotomy is very strong, and hopefully that will come across in the first part of this talk. But to get a bit of a better idea, let us quickly think about what it means actually to be an experiment. So what actually are experiments? And now, of course, there's lots of disputes how best to characterize experiments, but many agree that an investigation counts as a scientific experiment only if it satisfies the following features. So usually it delivers quantitative results. So we have, in the end, a certain data set that we analyze and try to bear on the problem that we started with. A scientific experiment aims to verify or falsify a hypothesis. This hypothesis is normally a prediction that comes out of the theoretical claims you make. Its results are in principle reproducible, so other people should be able then to go through the process of running such an experiment. It's done under controlled conditions. That's also a very important aspect, because often in experiments, we want to find relations between two things, like a cause and an effect. We don't want to manipulate all sorts of things. We want to really find out what exactly affects a certain event. And fifthly, a scientific experiment is supposed to be independent of the experimenter. It's supposed to have a certain objectivity. So if I run an experiment, it shouldn't depend on me personally having run this experiment. If you then do it, it shouldn't depend on you. It should be independent of the person doing it. So I guess that many will agree that experiments are presumably the most crucial aspect for scientific process, for scientific progress. And I think this can be somehow cashed out a little bit with this kind of picture here. So the bottom left, we do have a kind of a theory or a theoretical claim. And then depending on the discipline you're working in, psychology, physics, chemistry, and so on and so forth, you have your various tools and methods. Like, these are just three examples: fMRI, electron accelerators, thermal analysis. And then what scientists often do is then they run a scientific experiment to try to verify or falsify a certain hypothesis that comes out from the theory. A large amount of data is produced, or it should at least be sufficiently large to then support the theoretical claim that you're looking at. Or if, of course, the data shows that it poses problems for the theory, you might need to revise the theory accordingly. Now, what does this picture look like when it comes to philosophy? So, of course, we are also having lots of philosophical theories and theoretical claims that we make. But is there something similar going on in philosophy compared to the natural sciences? And I think there is. But before we can look at that, I think we should get clear on the fact, of course, that philosophical methods are quite different from scientific methods. So philosophical methods are fundamentally different from scientific methods. And when we look at theories, philosophical theories and philosophical claims, often we find two methods being looked at and being used quite substantially. There's, of course, lots of other methods, but for the purpose of this talk, I will only want to focus on conceptual analysis and the emphasis on valid and sound argumentation. So let's look at conceptual analysis. So conceptual analysis has the aim to analyze the structure and content of concepts like truth, knowledge, and responsibility, all very important concepts in philosophy. in order to gain a better understanding of the philosophical problems in which these concepts play a central role. So we want to know, of course, what truth is, right? What knowledge is, what it means to be responsible for a certain action. And getting clear on that will then help us to address other problems in which these concepts play a role. Let me use a fourth example, weakness of will. So here's a popular characterization of what weakness of will is. Namely, a person is weak-willed if one acts intentionally against one's own better judgment. So if I have made the judgment that I want to stick to a diet, for example, but then a cookie comes my way and I just grab the cookie and enjoy its taste, then I seem to be weak-willed to a certain extent. Why? Because I actually entertained the judgment that it would be better for me not to eat too many sweet stuff. But then when I see a cookie, I intentionally get the cookie and eat it. Now, how do we go about finding out whether this is a good characterization of weakness of will? We often, as philosophers, consider certain thought experiments and possible counterexamples. So take the case here of a computer addict, right, who is playing hours and hours games on the computer. So you might think that, well, actually, this person seems to satisfy the definition of weakness of will. The person perhaps thinks that it's best not to play computer games all day long, but then every morning the person intentionally sits down at the computer and plays computer games. However, we don't usually consider addictions as a kind of weak will, right? So we usually have a certain kind of a more negative attitude towards weakness of will. But when it comes to addiction, we usually think that these people are not weak-willed but need help because they are somehow in a certain spiral. So whether you agree with that or not, what the process of finding out whether we have arrived at a good definition of weakness of will is important here. Or of course, for truth, knowledge, and responsibility is the same. So going back to this picture, so we have the theoretical claim about weakness of will, and then we use conceptual analysis to find out what is a good way of depicting weakness of will. Specifically, then we look at certain thought experiments, in this case, an example of addiction. Now, the next steps are now crucial because this is now where experimental philosophy will provide a challenge. So usually, philosophers then go about this thought experiment in individually reflecting on this case. And this individual reflection leads to a certain intuition of, for example, of whether the case is a case of weakness of will or whether not. And the individual intuition, or of course, if you're in conversation with philosophers, it's perhaps and they agree with you, it's the intuitions of a small number of philosophers. They are then supposed to oppose a problem for that theoretical claim. So that looks quite similar to the natural sciences picture, right? So we start with a theoretical claim, we have a certain method that we use, and then either we run a scientific experiment, produce a large amount of data that bears on the problem, as in the natural sciences, or in philosophy, it seems, we reflect on a certain thought experiment that triggers an intuition that again then affects our theoretical stand. So let's go to the second method, or the second claim about philosophical methodology, that in philosophy we are more concerned with valid and sound argumentation. So consider the following two arguments. So here's an argument, a very famous argument from the natural sciences. It has two premises. So the first premise is all bodies fall at the same rate. The second premise is different bodies have different masses, from which we can conclude that the rate of free fall is independent of mass. So one of the cornerstones of Newtonian gravitational theory. Now consider the argument below, a philosophical argument. So the first premise states that pains are necessarily felt. So pains are feelings. And if pains are feelings, of course, they're necessarily felt. The second premise states bodily states like wounds, well, they can exist without being felt. Now, if these two premises are true, we can conclude that pains are not bodily states. Well, why not? Because pains seem to have different features or different characteristics than bodily states. Bodily states can exist without being felt. Pains are necessarily felt. Now, let's have a look at how scientists and philosophers provide evidence for these premises, right? We're interested, of course, in the validity of an argument, but we also want our arguments to be sound, right? We want the conclusions to be true. And of course, the truth of the conclusions only follow if the premises are true. So in the natural sciences, we verify the first premise, N1, by collecting lots of data from experiments. Now, this need not be the case. I mean, you can, of course, start with a single observation. You might know that famously Galileo Galilei stood on the tower of Pisa and dropped two objects, and they always fell to the ground at the same time. But of course, scientists are not content with that. They run more and more experiments and gather more data to really make sure that all bodies fall at the same rate. Now, what's going on in the philosophical argument? Of course, also philosophers provide evidence for premises, for example, like the claim that pains are necessarily felt. But the evidence is of a different sort. And similar to the case of conceptual analysis, it's mostly intuitions, or very often intuitions, that play an important role. So, for example, a thought experiment that might try to verify the first premise is to say, look, if pains were not necessarily felt, it might be that you just have lots of pains in your body currently, right? But that seems to be absurd. So pains are necessarily felt. So again, we use a thought experiment, reflect on that thought experiment, which triggers an intuition and which is then supposed to support a certain premise. So in both cases, we often deal with thought experiments. So when it comes to the providing support for arguments, for premises in philosophical arguments, when it comes to analyzing our central concepts in philosophy, we often use thought experiments that are designed to bring about intuitions. Now, here's the crucial bit. Whereas a scientific experiment is quantitative results that can be reproduced under controlled conditions, and remember the characteristics of what an experiment is, and are independent of the experimenter, individual reflection of thought experiments merely delivers a single data point, a single intuition that is highly subjective. So if we look at it, again, this kind of this picture comparing natural sciences, the natural sciences with philosophy, we do have important differences. While we do have an interaction with some empirical data, namely intuitions, there's a bit of a problem here. Namely, and this is now, I think, where experimental philosophy makes its main claim, and it raises its main challenge to more traditional philosophical methods. Namely, experimental philosophers argue that premises in philosophical arguments should not be supported by the intuitions of an individual or very few philosophers, but that we do a quantitative, objective analysis of intuitions of the many. So instead of using just individual reflection and the intuitions of a small number of philosophers, experimental philosophers propose that we actually run scientific experiments. And these experiments can then lead to a larger amount of data, more specifically, a large amount of intuitions from various people. So let me summarize the first part of this talk. So often, if you read some of the literature surrounding experimental philosophy, you see this kind of people saying like, oh, experimental philosophers want to experimentalize philosophy, or they challenge some of the philosophical methods that we use. I don't think that is actually correct. So it is not the philosophical methods like conceptual analysis and emphasis on sound argumentation that experimental philosophers are challenging. I think all the opposite. I think, you know, experimental philosophers are in favor of doing conceptual analysis, in favor of an emphasis on sound argumentation. However, experimental philosophers challenge the way evidence is produced in various fields of traditional philosophy. Instead of individual reflection leading to individual or a small number of intuitions, we should collect a larger number of intuitions from people through scientific experiments. Now, of course, that is often not possible. So it is not the claim of experimental philosophy that we should always run experiments. Of course, the premise, for example, needs to have an empirical foundation, right? So there are many premises that don't have that empirical foundation. And then, of course, it would be absurd to try to run an experiment to try to verify or falsify that premise. But as far as is possible, so if you put forward a premise for an argument that actually can be verified or falsified through an empirical experiment, then I think philosophers should be concerned with actually providing the strongest evidence possible, which means you need to run experiments, or you have someone else run these experiments. So this was obviously just a very brief kind of take on the main aim, I guess, of experimental philosophy. If you want to learn more about experimental philosophy, a good place to start is the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on experimental philosophy by Joshua Knope and Sean Nichols, who are both pioneers in the experimental philosophy movement. I now want to go on to actually run or show you how such an experiment can be run. And hopefully, because this was all now a bit theoretical, I hope to show that it really is an advantage, at least sometimes, to run an experiment, because we get different sorts of evidence. And the result is that we actually need to revise some arguments where perhaps if we had just relied on individual intuitions, we would wrongly consider a claim true. Just very briefly, if you want to know more, again, this can only be very brief now for the next 15 to 20 minutes, but if you want to know more about how to run your own experimental philosophical study, Justin Sitzma and Jonathan Livengood have this excellent introduction to the theory of and practice of experimental philosophy. So as the name suggests, there's a lot of information on how to really do it yourself, how to start by designing an experiment up to the analysis of the data that you collect. Okay, so let's get back to the philosophical argument that we consider. Pains are necessarily felt. Bodily states like wounds can exist without being felt, so pains cannot be bodily states. What does it actually mean to say that pains are necessarily felt? Well, another way of putting this would be to say there are no such thing as unfelt pains, right? Unfelt pains are not pains. Or again, in another way, we can say, well, if pains are necessarily felt, there is no way to distinguish pains from feeling pains, right? Because pains themselves are feelings. So that distinction cannot be made. Now, contrast that with, for example, a piece of chocolate, right? A piece of chocolate can, of course, exist without being seen, smelled, or tasted. We can distinguish a piece of chocolate from the taste or the feeling of eating chocolate, right? So these can be distinguished, but many argue that this is not possible for pains. Pains and feeling pains are just one and the same thing. Now, this is actually the standard view, not just in philosophy, but also in many areas of medicine and psychology. So here's the International Association of the Scientific Study of Pain and their definition of pain. They say pain is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience, a feeling. So again, here the focus is that pain is defined as a feeling. Again, if pain is a feeling, then unfelt pains don't make sense. There are no such thing as unfelt pains. And this is reflected by a majority of Western philosophers. So Michael Tai, Murad Aidid, Christopher Hill have all put forward views according to which unfelt pains don't exist. There is no such thing as an unfelt pain. Now, I think that, so I have to admit that I don't have any expertise when it comes to Indian philosophy, but I think that this kind of question of whether pain is subjective, of whether whether unfelt pains can exist, and whether we can distinguish pains from feelings of pain, seems also to be a recurring theme in Indian philosophy. So the Nyaya Vaisesika philosophy distinguishes pain and the feeling of pain. So that would be interesting to follow up on that. And as I said, I don't have any expertise on that, but if you have any input for me on how certain strands of Indian philosophy deal with that question, that would be very interesting for me to know. Okay, so here is the thought experiment by Christopher Hill that he proposes to show that unfelt pains don't exist. So he says, if we were fully committed to the picture, so the picture that pains can exist unfelt, we would be prepared to consider it possible that an injured soldier actually has a severe pain despite his professions to the contrary. So imagine, or he asks us to imagine an injured soldier, and he says he has no pain, and then to say that, well, actually he has a pain, that would be absurd. Pains don't exist unfelt. And here the second statement is really interesting. He says, when I have asked informants to assess the likelihood of this scenario, they have all been inclined to dismiss it as absurd. So funnily enough, Hill is actually not just relying on his own individual intuition. So that's good, right? He actually goes out and asks people whether they share the intuition that an injured soldier who says he doesn't feel any pain really doesn't have a pain. But of course, we don't know more about who are his informants. Are they 2? Are they 3? Did 4 people say yes? 5 people say no? We don't know. And we also don't know whether his informants were other philosophers, maybe other philosophers who already have a particular view and didn't really try to evaluate the scenario neutrally. So let's be more scientific and run an experiment. So when you try to design your own experiment, you very often, and this is perhaps the most common method in experimental philosophy, you basically design a little survey, a kind of a questionnaire. And in this very instance, it's quite easy because there is already a thought experiment at stake, right? So Hill already proposes this thought experiment, so we can use this and try to write our own story, which we can then put to people. So here's the vignette I wrote. In many situations, when soldiers sustain serious injuries during a battle, they show no sign of feeling pain. Only after the end of the battle, they show clear pain behavior. Now, Greg is in a battle and has been severely injured. When asked whether he feels pain, he denies it. So I think this is a very truthful depiction of the thought experiment that Christopher Hill has in mind. So the next step, the second step, is then to say, okay, so how do we now ask a certain question? So that's the question format. And I decided now here in this specific case to ask people to tell me how much they agree with the following statement: during the battle, Greg has a pain. You can use all sorts of different questions. You can use binary questions. You can give people multiple answers. There's advantages and disadvantages in favor of both of these various methods. There is a big advantage of using this particular method of asking people to agree with a certain statement, because the analysis of the data is then often a little bit easier than if you ask a different question format. And that's the third step. This was the answer format. So people then, of course, have to give me their answer. They have to respond to that statement, and they can choose on a 7-point Likert scale ranging from -3 to +3. And of course, they can select all sorts of points in between. They can be neutral about this question, or they can say, well, I agree slightly, 1, I agree quite strongly, or I totally agree, and of course, the same with disagreement. So this is what is called, this kind of description here is what is called the test condition, because this is really the very interesting question, or the interesting questionnaire that we want to put forward. And we're really interested to know, well, what do people say? Is it correct what Michael Tai and others are saying? Like Christopher Hill and so on, or do people think differently than what the standard view in philosophy is? It's also good to have, though, a control condition. And I also therefore designed a control condition because control conditions have a dual purpose. First, they allow you to find out whether your design really works, right? So they are a little bit of kind of a way of finding out, well, if I do that in a very kind of a simple way, in a controlled way, then the people's answers show that the way that I described the scenario really worked. Secondly, it allows you now to contrast the responses of two different cases, of the control condition and of the test condition. So let me just read out the control condition. In many situations when soldiers sustain serious injuries during a battle, they show every sign of feeling pain. After the end of the battle, they show clear pain behavior. Greg is in a battle and has been severely injured. When asked whether he feels pain, he confirms it. How much do you agree with the following statement? During the battle, Greg has a pain. And of course, we expect here for people to all agree with that statement, right? So that's not the difficult one. The other one is the difficult one. But having this control condition allows you to see how much deviation do you have from the easy control condition. So here are the predictions we make based on the standard philosophical theory. So let's focus on the control condition down here to the right. So I just said what we expect the average response to be very high, somehow between 1.5 and 2.7, 2.8. You never get to 3 really, because there are always people who are slightly more skeptical or more cautious or have different views on the matter. But if you ask enough people, you should get an average response for the control condition. So the case where the person shows every sign of feeling pain and where the person confirms that he or she is in pain, that you get really high agreement. Now, in the case, in the test condition, right, the one that interests us the most, well, if the standard view is correct, then we should have an average response that is very low, that is in the disagreement part, right? Maybe between minus 1.5 and minus 2.5. So if the philosophers are right, if a person denies that he or she is feeling pain, then people should not say that Greg has a pain, right? Unfelt pains are not pains. That's the standard view. So we want to do two things now. We want to find out whether the average response really is in that area and whether this is significantly different to the neutral midpoint. So the neutral midpoint is 0, and what we expect if the standard philosophical theory is correct is to have significant difference in the positive realm for the control condition and for significant difference in the negative realm for the neutral midpoint. For the test condition from the neutral midpoint. And we also look at the difference between the two conditions, right? We want to find out what exactly changes if a person denies that he or she is feeling pain. So how do you now proceed? And I think there's very roughly just two options. You can either go out and ask people to answer your survey, right? So you could, for example, go on the streets, ask people, and then do a little interview with them and note the answers and try to get as many people as possible to have a large database. The second is perhaps the more popular one, especially nowadays with all the internet possibilities that we've got, is to actually put your survey online and recruit participants from online platforms. So you can put your survey online. There's various options: SurveyMonkey, Lime Survey, Qualtrics. Some of them are for free, some of them are quite expensive. But there are good options out there for putting your survey online. And there's also excellent options to recruit participants from online platforms. So here are the two perhaps most popular ones that are used by experimental philosophers, Mechanical Turk and Prolific Academia. So in that very case, I actually use Qualtrics to put my survey online. So you see here the very description that I showed you a few slides before, I basically put up on Qualtrics. And people will then go through that survey and answer the question. And I use Prolific to recruit participants. So you can see here, I did this 6th of January 2021, so really just yesterday at 11:23, I ran this experiment, and I asked people to tell me how much they agreed with the statement. And you see then the answers come in, and people then get reimbursed for their participation. So once all the responses are in, so in this particular case, I had two conditions, the control condition and the test condition, and I asked 40 participants each. So I had a total of 80 participants. It's a kind of a rough ballpark number to have 40 participants per condition. The more, the better. But of course, more participants also cost more money. You can actually use certain tools to calculate what would be a good number of participants. But very roughly, 40 participants per condition is a good number. So once I had these 80 participants giving me their responses, and I basically just downloaded the output file. And you can choose between different file formats. Here, this is an Excel file. And you can see here in the two columns, feeling no pain and feeling pain, I had the two conditions. And then people gave, you can see already the responses that people gave. All right, so let's get to the results. And let's start with a control condition, because that, as I mentioned before, that should be the easy one, right? So we said in the case in which a person shows every sign of feeling pain, in which a person confirms that she or he is in pain, we expect that the average response, so taking the average of all responses, should be very high. So most people should agree that during the battle, Greg has a pain. And indeed, that is what I got yesterday, right? So the average response is 2.575, so actually very high. So almost all participants gave a 2 or a 3 rating. Now, what about the test condition, right? So we predicted, given the standard theory in philosophy, that we should have a negative result here. So we should have an average result that shows that people disagree that Greg has a pain if he denies that he feels any pain. However, that is not what we found. So in actual fact, people, by and large, are more in agreement with the claim that Greg has a pain, despite denying that he feels a pain. Now, it's not as high as in the control condition, so there is a difference. So it does matter whether people say they don't have a pain, or whether they don't feel a pain. Sorry, I just had a pop-up window asking me for a comment, but I think I'm just refusing now for the moment. So despite this difference between the two conditions, we don't find evidence for the standard view that says that unfelt pains don't exist. Instead, we find, well, actually, if you look at all the responses, you find a quite wide distribution. So many people actually agree that Greg has a pain, whereas there are a substantial number of people as well who disagree that Greg has a pain. In average, then we have a result that is fairly close to the neutral point, midpoint, but is slightly more on the positive side of things. Okay, so I mentioned before we wanted to find out two things. We wanted to find out whether it makes a difference, so whether there's a difference between the control condition and the test condition, and there is indeed a significant difference. So it does matter whether a person denies or confirms to feel a pain, whether people think that person has a pain. However, the average result for the test condition is not significantly below the midpoint. In fact, the average result is above the midpoint. So people, and that of course is a conclusion that I draw in some of my work on the concept of pain, is that many people think that pains are bodily states. So if a person is injured, that indicates that the person has a pain. It doesn't so much matter whether the person has a certain feeling of pain. What matters for a person to have pain is the bodily state, the injury, the wound, or what have you. So here a little bit of advertisement. If you're more interested in experimental studies on the full concept of pain, I've written quite a few articles together with Justin Sitzma. He's also an excellent philosopher, an excellent experimental philosopher. He works in many areas of experimental philosophy, and it's worth reading his stuff anyway. If you're interested in pain, look at that stuff. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well. So let's get back to the pain argument, right? We said that here's an argument in philosophy. Pains are necessarily felt. Bodily state like wounds can exist without being felt. Therefore, pains are not bodily state. And people use a thought experiment. So, for example, they use the thought experiment of the injured soldier to show that P1 is true. What was the method? Individual reflection on the case that triggers an intuition, just intuitions of a small number of philosophers that then supports this premise. But what we've seen now in the experiment is that once we actually change the evidence and change the amount of evidence and bring more evidence to bear on the issue than intuitions of a few philosophers. So if we run a scientific experiment, we find that the intuitions of a large number of people actually contradicts the idea that pains are necessarily felt. And this is basically why experimental philosophers push the idea so much that we shouldn't just rely on our own intuitions. We should go out there and look what the intuitions of perhaps of people are who haven't already bought perhaps into a certain philosophical theory. So now, of course, you might think, no. Philosophers are the better intuitors. They have the better intuitions. And of course, such an objection needs to be taken seriously. And many have already looked at this objection and have tried to show that very often the intuitions of experts, in this case philosophers, are not better than the intuitions of lay people. However, that needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis. You might also object to the way I've run this experiment. You might object to the way I've asked a question. You might think that I have misled people. You might think that I have biased people into certain answers. So these would all be valid criticism, and of course they need to be taken seriously. But the general thrust of the argument that I want to present today is not that there could be problems with a single scientific experiment that we run in philosophy, but rather that this evidence is important, that we should just not rely only on the intuitions of a small group of philosophers, but we should actually look at the intuitions of a larger number of people, because it might well be that we as philosophers are quite mistaken about what we believe is the case or not. So in this particular case, I might want to even put forward the claim that, well, premise one is false, and therefore it doesn't follow that pains are not bodily states. Now, of course, it doesn't follow that there might not be other good arguments in favor of that conclusion, but at least this particular argument seems to be problematic. Right, so let me conclude then. So experimental philosophers do not believe that X5 methods can be used in all areas of philosophy and for all philosophical problems. There are many areas in philosophy where you wouldn't even know how to go about running any experiment, because it's not the premises are not based on certain empirical claims or what have you. So experimental philosophers do not want to basically say that we always need to run experiments when we do philosophy. However, there are many areas where claims are made that are subject to empirical investigation. And I think that as philosophers, we should be concerned with getting the best available evidence in support of our theoretical claims. I think that is a standard that we should live up to, right? We should live up to the idea that let's get the best available evidence for the theoretical claims that we put forward. And I think, so if you're interested in running your own experimental study, if the field in which you're working in makes certain empirical assumptions, try to run an experiment, even if it's small at the beginning, right? See if you find some evidence. Often, and in many of the studies I've run in the past, I was able to confirm philosophers' intuitions. So the idea is not, let's show that philosophers are wrong, right? That's not the idea. Often the intuitions of many people show that philosophers were spot on with their intuitions. However, we need the best available evidence, and that can only be gotten by running an experiment. If in doubt, and that's my closing statement, get in contact with myself or other experimental philosophers. We love to grow the community, so feel free to ask questions or write at a later stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kevin. Lovely, interesting, I must say. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing your views on experimental. Am I audible, Piyush? Yeah, okay. So thank you very much. And you have actually opened a new arena of for philosophy, for another paradigm that we were not so introduced before your lecture. So though I have my own queries and concerns with regard to running experiments onto the concept of self, like metaphysical issues, how would you run some form of experiment? And when it comes to actually conducting an experiment on the concept of self, shall we just take it to be, the word and belief of people for the denial or approval of existence of self? So that is just in the backdrop, but I am sure that we have students and we have questions from YouTube also. There are people who are attending your lecture on YouTube also. So we have questions, and if time permits, you can address my question later on, but we'll pick up the questions from the students first. First of all, the question from, this is Dr. Koshi Tharkan, and the question is, wouldn't the culture of peer reviewing of research and disciplinary orientations of the problems discussed by an individual philosopher to some extent take care of the requirement of experimental philosophy?
I think that to a certain degree it does. So if a philosopher tries to publish an article and the article or the philosopher makes certain claims about, certain, for example, certain intuitions that she or he has that are not shared by the reviewers, then I think this would come up in the discussion, and the philosopher might need to specify or need to revise that part of the paper. So I think that is the case to a certain degree. However, I think that peer reviewers will often have the same intuitions as other philosophers because they form one very homogeneous group of people. So I think that, as professional philosophers need to go through many years of education. They are presented with lots of thought experiments by professional philosophers, and they basically adjust, I think, their intuitions in line with what has already been put out there in the literature. And sometimes this actually leads to, there's some empirical research out there that people who don't share the intuitions of professional philosophers will drop out of philosophy because they think, well, I'm not getting it, or something is wrong with me, I don't know, right? So, and that's of course really, really sad, because these intuitions are exactly what's at stake, right? And if the literature is quite strongly favoring the view that, for example, unfelt pains don't exist, then at a certain stage, if I study 3 years the philosophy of pain, I'll probably buy into that intuition. And later on, if I'm a reviewer of another article, I will not anymore question that very intuition that is put forward by the philosopher. So I think, yes, it does catch some of the shaky intuitions from philosophers, but I don't think it catches all of them. And we need experiments to really catch all of them, so to say.
Right. Right. So another question from Neelakanteshwar Reddy, if psychology is already experimenting on mind behavior, isn't experimental philosophy of mind redundant? So I think there is a jumbled presumption in here in the question.
That's a super good question. And it's also a bit difficult to answer. I think that to a certain extent, experimental philosophy and at least some experimental philosophy, for example, if you look at the experimental philosophical literature on moral cognition, psychologists and experimental philosophers work on the same topics and are in conversation with each other. I think this is actually a great thing, right? I don't want philosophers to only talk among themselves. It's great if we start to have that greater interaction in certain fields. For example, when it comes to philosophy of mind, with empirical scientists like many psychologists are. However, I think that this would be too simple an answer, because there are many problems that philosophers are interested in that psychologists are not so much interested in. For example, when it comes to the case we discussed, there are certain psychologists who are interested in the full concept of pain, and I've shared my ideas with some psychologists. But many of them are interested in certain different problems when it comes to pain. And it would, of course, be presumptuous for me to think that, look, psychologists, please deal with my problem first. It's more important than the problems that you have to deal with. For example, I talked a lot with people who deal with chronic pain patients, right? And of course, they're also interested in knowing more about what people actually mean when they use the word pain, when they talk about pain. But of course, they have many other issues to deal with as well. So in that case, I can't just say, look, can you run an experiment for me? You're a psychologist, you know a lot about doing experiments. No, that won't work, right? I have to run my own experiment and have to see how it deals with the philosophical problems I'm concerned with, and how perhaps it also deals with certain psychological problems that experimental scientists are interested in. But to a certain extent, I do think that experimental philosophy wants to bridge a gap, at least in various parts, between philosophy and the cognitive sciences. Sorry, I can't hear you now.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you for your answer. And I think we have Ankush, if you wish to ask your question directly.
So I basically was asking if about the reflection, as you talked about the different stages in scientific and philosophical experiments. So I put that question out first, but then later it got answered as you like went into the
All
topic.
right.
So that's basically
All right.
what psychology. So I had another question, which is while you're talking about pain, could you comment on how phantom pain might work out in the sense of feeling pain or like having pain?
Sorry, which sort of pain?
Phantom pain. When somebody does not have say a limb or something, but then they feel pain in that limb.
Okay. So very good question again. So I think the idea of phantom pain is very, very interesting for philosophical theories about pain. So and the phantom limb case is often also, you might know, used to support the idea that pains must be feelings, right? So what else should be going on when people have a phantom pain? Now, I would say no, they don't have pains. However, of course, I wouldn't deny that they feel any pain. So what these experiments suggested is that you can really make this distinction between pain and feeling pain. What they don't have is the pain because the limb was amputated, and the bodily part, so to say, is gone. So the pain is gone. However, they have the feeling of pain. And I don't know how people, for example, express themselves when they have phantom pain. So it might well be, that's actually something I wanted to get into, because it might be really interesting to find out whether they more regularly speak about experiences and feelings of pain, or more about the pain itself. And I'm not saying that there might be quite a jumble of concepts here. And as you've seen in the experiment, the population seems to be a bit split. And this is actually something we did find. So in my work together with Justin Sitzma, we regularly got this 60 to 70% of the population seem to think that pains are more bodily. 30 to 40% of the population seem to think of pains as quite strongly a mental phenomenon. So, and this of course makes it really interesting. So why is it the case that there might be two conceptions out there? So another view put forward by Emma Borg, for example, and colleagues, she says that it's a polysemy view, or some kind of a mixed view, where sometimes the bodily aspect of pain is the more dominant one, and sometimes the mental aspect of pain is the more dominant one. And it's not just that we have this bodily conception of pain or the mental conception. So it wouldn't be correct for me to say, well, our experiments show that we're all bodily theorists. I think that would be wrong. But at least a certain amount of people, perhaps even the majority of the population, think of it as bodily. And in the case of phantom limb, then it would be interesting to find out how phantom limb patients think about their pain, right? Do they think, no, I don't have a pain because pains are something in the body, and I've only got the suffering aspect is still there without the pain? Or if they have this more mental conception, they probably go ahead in talking about pain.
I don't really know much about personal perspectives of patients dealing with this. I came around reading studies in neuroscience, how they used fMRI to understand that the pain signals were coming into the brain and how it was working out. So yeah, it's pretty interesting thinking about it. One more thing.
I think Ankush will pick other questions now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So we have another question by Udhav Surekha. That is, could you share how experimental philosophy could be used in metaphysical theories?
Thanks for that question. It's a question I often try to dodge a little bit, but it's of course an important question. So I think it depends a lot on what your view is about the relation between our concepts and the world, right? So if you believe that the concepts we use basically cuts the world at its joints, as it's often the kind of the phrase, right? Then of course, the experiments would tell you not only about how we think about pain, but actually about the metaphysics of pain as well. Now, because if the idea is that our concepts, the concepts we use directly basically latch onto the world, then the way I think about the world, the way people think about the world, is telling me something about the phenomenon in the world. So in that case, doing research on how we think about pain also tells you directly about pain. If, however, you think that, no, there's a big gap between the two, that when we think about pain and the actual phenomenon of pain are something different, then of course you might be much more cautious. You might, for example, take it as some evidence for the metaphysics of pain, but not all we should rely on, right? You might think that there's many other things that you should take into account when it comes to the metaphysics of pain, and the way we think about pain is just one piece of the evidence. And to be honest, I think that it very much depends on the concept itself. I think that, for example, the way we think about free will tells us a lot about our own conception, but it tells us perhaps quite little about free will itself, right? So here, perhaps the gap between the way we think about free will and what really free will is, if it exists at all, is quite large. In other areas, and I think pain might be one of those areas, I can hardly think, I don't think that the gap is very large. I think actually, if we think of pain in a certain way, that tells us something about pain, right? Not just about the way we think about pain. But as I say, I think it depends on the area. Free will, on the one hand, there might be a big gap between the concept and the metaphysics. In other areas, perhaps knowledge and pain, the gap might be very close.
Right. Thank you. So another question for you. This is by Garima. Can the example of psychosomatic disorders and the conditions such as congenital insensitivity to pain be used as an argument against the premise pains are necessarily felt?
So I guess that when you have congenital insensitivity to pain, so I'm not an expert on that disorder, so correct me if I'm wrong, but then you have no feelings of pain, right? So so in that case, perhaps the right way of putting the disorder would rather be congenital insensitivity to feelings of pain, rather than congenital. Well, in a way, you are insensitive to the bodily states and to the nerves that travel up to your mind. So I don't think they provide strong arguments against the premise. But again, here it would be really interesting to find out how those people think about pains. Now, I think that if these people have this disorder from very early on, then they might develop different concepts to the ones that we actually share in a community of speakers who are sensitive to pain. So there's super interesting research on the way children express their pains, right? So for example, let me just give you one example because I think it's a fascinating one. So there's a child talking to her mother, and the child says, I have a pain in my stomach. And the mother says, well, lie down on the couch and relax and the pain will go away. And the child then says, where will it go, right? So this idea of that the pain is somewhere and it could travel somewhere, right? And of course, that is not what probably the mother had in mind, but rather that somehow the problem in the body, it goes away, whatever. I think it's very interesting how the way we interact with our children shapes their concept of pain. And of course, different communities could end up with different concepts of pain. So I think actually that the concept of pain has gone through a big transformation during the last few centuries. So if you read literature from a few hundred years ago, people, for just as again one example, people put mud on people's wounds, and of course that can alleviate the pain, and we know that is a good thing to do. But they did not only think that this can alleviate the pain, they also thought that the pain goes into the mud and you can take the pain away, right? So again, suggesting that we conceptualize pain quite often as something that is in the body, and if we do the right thing with the body, maybe we can take the pain out of that body part. Now, I think maybe this view is still very present in some areas. It definitely has been quite present in the past. And of course, nowadays, scientists tell us a different story, that is not a good way to think about pain. But it tells us something that we initially started with, an idea of pain as something very bodily and not something that is primarily a mental phenomenon.
Right. So one last question for you. And I think, and that is by Simran Tapaswi. That is, her question is, all right. What do you think about the relationship between the methods of experimentation and speculation? What place does experimental philosophy have in the domains of philosophy that are essentially speculatory or speculative?
I have to admit, I know too little about this area of philosophy that you're talking about. But I would probably double down on the claim that I made during the talk, namely that you will often not be able to run an experiment on some of the claims that you make, either because they are meant not to be empirically investigated, because they are somehow speculative, maybe because there is no way to empirically investigate that issue, maybe it's not. It's for example, in mathematics, we don't go around and do experiments, right? Mathematics is a discipline which is not set up for empirical verification or falsification, at least most of the claims. It very much depends, but I suppose that even in speculative philosophy, you will start from certain assumptions, right? You don't want to start from nothing. You want to start from something and then perhaps go in certain directions that you find interesting, that might not be mainstream, but that are nonetheless interesting, and see how far you can push a certain argument. The assumptions themselves might be empirical based or not. And if they are, I think it might be a good idea to actually try to get the best evidence for these assumptions, because that makes your view, of course, stronger if you have good evidence for that position. Sorry, I think you're still muted.
Yeah. Piyush keeps muting me all the time. Yeah. So, Professor Sebastian, would you like to say as a last?
Thank you, Shivani. Well, I enjoyed Professor Kevin's beautiful talk. But having said that, sir, I have a small question, not a question, rather a clarification from the last questionnaire. See, generally speaking, there are two different kinds of research methods. One we talk as the quantitative research method, another one is the quantitative research method. Now, generally speaking, especially we can say the quantitative methods actually are being used by the natural sciences, whereas in social sciences and philosophy and humanities, no, we use the qualitative research method. Now, my question is that when you are talking about the experimental philosophy, I mean, are you trying to experiment with the consciousness itself, or are you trying to experiment with the consciousness of the object? Okay, I mean, I think one has to make a distinction here between, the consciousness of the object, okay, and the other one is the object itself. Now, another question which of course I would like to ask, I don't know, I may be wrong. See, why do we want to make a distinction between pain and feeling of pain? So, can we talk about pain apart from the emotion or the feeling of the pain? I think, rather maybe to my understanding, it is difficult. So can you please give me some light about that? Thank you.
So I think that most experimental philosophy, when it comes to the experiment, to consciousness, is more in the business of finding out what our concept of consciousness is. So again, we have this gap again between the concept of consciousness and consciousness. So I think Justin Sitzma but also many others have again done some really interesting experiments on how we think about certain conscious states. Now, I think often these studies stand by itself as certain theories about how we think about consciousness, right? Full stop. However, there are connections between, again, the concept of consciousness and consciousness, right? So, and for example, I think it's very interesting to show that, some of the literature, I think, does that to show that some aspects of the way we think about consciousness is contradictory, right? And you have certain strands in the way you think about consciousness. And also, that's not just lay people's thoughts, that's also philosophers' thoughts, right, that are contradictory. And then, of course, it has a massive bearing on theories of consciousness, because, of course, we don't want our theories about consciousness to be somehow intertwined somehow with some contradictory perspectives that we themselves have about consciousness. So I think there's lots of interesting connections. So I think, again, it needs to be looked at case by case. Some studies make it quite explicit that they only want to find out about how we think about the world, not about the world itself. Others want to make that larger claim. I think they are sometimes justified in making that claim. I think, for example, when it comes to pain, and which is, of course, an aspect of consciousness, we are justified in making that claim. But of course, again, some caution is definitely advisable.
Right. So, time to thank you formally once again. We thank you, Professor Kevin Reuter, for taking out time to be with us, to address us, and especially the first ever batch of the Center of Phenomenology and Cognitive Science at the Department of Philosophy. We are very thankful for the kind of presentation of the idea of experimental philosophy that you have introduced us. I think that was very, very lucid and very crisp. And the case presentation that especially the way you presented through the case and enunciating the problem, and that to concretizing it with the help of the example of the pain. And I'm sure that Greg must be repenting throughout your lecture that you have put him in such pain. Even if he was not there in, the battlefield, but he was here with us. So we are really thankful for just being with us, for enlightening us on this new domain of philosophy, and looking forward to have you again sometime soon on another, some different examples. As I just said, that the metaphysics is still left apart. It is still unaddressed. And we would certainly like to hear your views as to how to address the metaphysical, experimentation on metaphysical issues too. So we still have scope to have you back again sometime. So thank you so much. And thank you, one and all. Thank you, Professor Sebastian, Professor Geeta Manaktala, Professor Seema Vinayak. And thank you, students. Thank you, participants. And thank you, Piyush, for making it up. So thank you all for joining this event. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you from my side as well. It's been a wonderful occasion. Thank you for the questions. Very, very good questions to think about. So, and again, thanks for the invitation to have me in this series.
Our pleasure. Pleasure.